In the year 913 near Gorgan on the southeastern coast of the Caspian Sea in modern-day Iran, a vast fleet of 500 warships came into view with the shocked and terrified traders and townspeople arrayed by the shore. They'd had their fair share of raiders over the years, riding down from the Caucasus from the steppe lands to the north and across the Persian plains from the east, but it immediately became apparent that this was different. They were ships unlike any of the locals had seen before. Small, exceptionally mobile masted war guns floated by snarling dragon heads manned a strong northern oarsman filled with axe-wielding raiders. The leaders were Scandinavians, the rest an amalgamation of Scandinavian and Swath, and they had traveled for hundreds of miles along the vast networks of rivers in the Eastern Europe to raid the shores of the Caspian Sea. Their overlord Igor had recently in 912 been crowned as the king of the Kievan Rus, a huge area encompassing parts of modern-day Russia and much of the Ukraine and surrounding countries. At the time of his death he ruled over the largest state ever since the 8th century. Scandinavians have not only looked to the west for expansion, to the east as well, whereas opportunistic young Danes and Norsemen tended to look westward to Great Britain, France and the North Sea. At first trade and later reigned and settle in order to make a better life for themselves outside of their barren, overpopulated homerooms. The people of modern-day Sweden had long looked eastward across the Baltic Sea to Finland, the Baltic states and Russia, the opportunities of their own, and as the years went by he gradually began to look further and further afield in the west. When Scandinavians went raiding they were known as Vikings, which derives from the Old Norse term the sea raider or tolerate. In the east however they were known as Ferengians, which likely derives from the Old Norse word of Allah meaning pledge, and Ganji phoenix sword companion. The large majority population of Slavic peoples who lived in these lands seem to have merged somewhat with the rankings and generally seem to have formed the ruling elite together. They began to forge a new distinct culture different from the Slavic tribes which bordered their lands and different from the Scandinavians to the north. Large cities were founded in places such as Novgorod and Kiev where Scandinavian customs gradually over the generations began to give way to a new amalgamation of Slav and scrambling. The Rohirrim dynasty, allegedly founded by the semi-legendary heroic Prince Rorik in the second half of the 9th century and solidified by his successor Oleg, established themselves firmly the masters of the Rus people and began to rule a roughly centralized state ruled by local strongmen based on tribute. When the next ruler Igor came to the throne in 913, he inherited a huge loud mass of wild river system in towns still largely chaotic but all pledging allegiance to the overall ruler at Kiev. The society of the Rus was undoubtedly martial nature, still awash in the Scandinavian culture of their forefathers. They worshipped the Norse gods and undertook the ancient Scandinavian funerary practice of ship burial, as evidenced by first-hand accounts which of our Muslim travelers such as Even Flatland during the 10th century, and also by substantial hard archaeological evidence. The 913 expedition into the Caspian Sea was probably the furthest and most ambitious voyage the Scandinavians ever undertaken. It's unclear whether Igor was personally involved, although as ruler, and would likely have given consent and patronized the expedition. The raiders loaded up on huge amounts of loot at Baku in modern-day Azerbaijan and harried the Iranian coastline for weeks until finally on their way home they were defeated by the Karts themselves, a strong tribal confederation of Asiatic steppe known as ruled over a substantial empire to the east of the Rus and held a monopoly over the new creative trade routes of the region. The Rus continued to raid all over their world, but the biggest prize of all lay directly to the south of them over the Black Sea at Constantinople, known to them as Miklagard, long the center of world civilization. Constantinople, now modern-day Istanbul, was the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the unbroken continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. It was a vast city surrounded by the incredibly strong Theodosian walls which have never been breached. In 941 Igor, at the head of a large fleet, arrived seemingly out of nowhere along with a huge army. Greater armies the Nama tried her, but despite a valiant first attack the Byzantines held them up. They attacked again in 944 and their small highly maneuverable long ships were difficult to deal with. Ultimately however the fleet was destroyed by Greek fire, an ancient and highly effective technique long held secret by The Byzantines in the aftermath. Igor's position was still so strong the Byzantines made a truce with him on favorable terms. Meanwhile, in 943 another more successful raid on the customers. This time the Rus captured the city of Barca, modern-day U.S. Vyong, where they stayed for several months, massacring the local population and amassing a substantial plunder before dysentery forced them to head back, now ships laden with massive amounts of loot and slaves. This time however they made it back without cars. Our involvement who themselves would be next on the agenda. The 943 raid was likely just one of many at the tunnel and simply represented the largest and most worthy of conically eventually under evil successor status. Laughs large Khazar cities such as Circle and Kerch began to be plundered and destroyed, which had the long-term effect of destabilizing the Khazar cabinet until it was eventually defeated entirely by the Rus over the coming decades in 1945 in a manner perhaps befitting the harsh and brutal nature of his world. Igor was captured and gruesomely killed by the dragoons subject Slavic Track, according to the primary chronicle of Bruce. After attempting to tax the driver unit in too harsh a manner, they captured Igor and tied him down to two bent-over birch trees, which were then released and allowed to straighter, which tearing his body apart and killing him instantly. His wife Olga, upon hearing the news, wiped out the Devlins entirely in retribution, burning many alive with buildings, enslaving the rest before consolidating her power by ruling as regent for her young son Svetoslav, although was a recent convert to Christianity, and while the young heir to the throne continued to worship the Norse gods of his father. More and more Rus became interested in the Eastern Orthodox faith, the Byzantium, just like the Vikings in the West who had settled in Great Britain and France eventually became Catholic. The Varangians of the East soon became influenced by the Byzantine culture, but they had first attacked but later learned from, eventually in part adopted Sparta. Slav continued the Rus policy of the persistently raid in attacking pretty much all of the peoples around, later earning the title of the Brain. Being remembered as one of the greatest kings of the European history. They allied with the Byzantines at times and fought against the Mitosis, as well as waging successful campaigns against the Bulgar Empire and the Kazakh Argonite. Why is Death/Islam ruled over one of the most powerful states in Europe and arguably the largest under his descendant Vladimir the Great. In the late 10th century the Rus gradually became Eastern Orthodox Christians, a longtime allies of Byzantium, before eventually over the centuries they gradually evolved into the modern-day nation-states of Russia and Ukraine. Unlike practically any other dynasty from the early Middle Ages, the Rockets allegedly survived as rulers in Russia in an unbroken line of succession. Prince heroic all those centuries of ago, until finally they were replaced by the Romanovs in the 17th century. Cadet branches of the family also ruled all over Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages, those contributing to the formation of many of the modern-day nation-states area.